So this is how important this food symposium is, because people from all over the world, from really high up all the way through down to grassroots level, come and sit on this stage and talk and engage. So, President Gilbert, Houngbo, former president of Togo, current president of IFAD, and also chair of UN Water. Which of those jobs did you love or do you love the most?
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to the Fireside Chat, Mr. President.
I think that's quite a very tricky question. I will, to be politically incorrect, I will put the three together. Running a government, the small country, has its own challenge. My current job has its own challenge. But the common point of that is serving the most needed people. And that is my core.
Mm-hmm. When you wake up every morning, what is it that gets you out of bed?
Myself, I come from quite a rural family, and my parents were farmers. In those years, when today I realize that we still have a big part of the population in many countries that are going through the same challenge like 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. Although globally there has been a lot of progress, we need to recognize that. However, the fact that we still have a big portion, and in some countries up to 2/3 of the population living below $2 a day, for me is quite unacceptable. And I always believe that every single day I need to ask myself what I could do to help improving this.
So the theme for this year's food symposium is water scarcity,
yeah.
Going from scarcity to security. Tell us a cautionary tale from your experience about water scarcity, and then follow it up with a very successful story.
What will come to my mind as a caution, an example where one had to really be prudent is not to give example of something that works, but not being able to scale it up. I'll give an example. Somewhere in Chad, we have a project in Chad. From northern Nigeria to Niger to Chad, we have, and in other countries, there is a serious problem between the settled farmers and the pastoralists. And that can really provoke and cause social unrest. So we developed quite a very good project by setting up water points and community management, bringing everybody together to manage those points for water, not only for the population, but also from the livestock and so forth. So it's working fairly well. Peace is there, and they are very happy, and even the women can start having some income-generating activity through vegetable production. But that is serving about 7,000 people. The challenge for us is that you create expectation. But when you see the whole population in the area, but we are not able to serve, that could become another problem through what you're trying to do very well. On the flip side, a project in Senegal, for example, in a region that we call the Matam region, given the whole Sahel situation, the climate change that we start seeing the impact, it's a region where 45% of the population are living below the poverty line. So what we did there is to have an integrated project, including boreholes, pipeline, water storage facilities, which has not only brought the water in the communities, but helped the communities to make use, not only for the daily life, but also for income-generating activities, both increasing also the livestock dimension, which is also another very, very quite, all of a sudden, women that used to walk up to 8-10 miles a day to go and fetch water, all of that is in the past now, is quite working very well. So we do have a positive story as well.
When is World Water Day, UN Water Chair?
No, we celebrated on 19...
It's March the 22nd, it's coming up.
Yes.
Yes. That wasn't meant to be a trick question. All right, whoops. So World Water Day is coming up.
Yeah.
What is your thought as UN Water Chair about World Water Day? What should we be thinking about? What are you thinking about?
No, I mean, we estimate up to 3 billion people that do not have access to drinkable water or sanitation. So for me, this is where we really need to think about. The second thing, it's important to keep in mind that water can be the solution for peacemaking, and the same water can be also source of conflict. So we better all together in a partnership trying to tackle those problems.
So the next panel is connecting the dots between agriculture, climate resilience, and also the private sector. Do you feel that you're comfortable to be in that discussion?
I hope so.
Yes, very good, because I would like you to sit there. Hello, panel. Good morning. Come along and sit by the UN chair, the former president of Togo, and also the president of IFAD. Do not feel intimidated.
How are you? Please.
Very good. Excellent. And your moderator is Estelle Youssoufa. Hello, Estelle. Enjoy the panel.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Estelle Youssoufa. I'm thrilled to be your host this morning. Please forgive my French accent. I'm the Frenchie in the room, and I'll be exiting soon. As Femi said, we'll be discussing connecting the dots between agriculture, climate resilience, and the private sector with our esteemed guests. Next to me, Gilbert Houngbo, president of IFAD, who just spoke before. Next to him is Nick Austin, director of the agricultural development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Next to him is Betsy Otto, global director of the water program at the World Resource Institute, and Kilian Gutumbiona at the Syngenta Project Liaison, senior researcher at the Wageningen University and Research in Netherlands. Forgive me, my Netherlands friends. And last but not least, Steven Schonberger, director at the Water Global Practice at the World Bank. Agriculture production and profit are heavily dependent on climate, and we know that climate change is projected to impact water and temperature. Therefore, extreme climate events such as floods, droughts, hurricanes will become, more frequent and destroy crops. Climate change is directly threatening food production and food security. If we look at the projection figures, they are alarming, with estimated price increases ranging from 10 to 30%, and hunger rate projected increases rates of about 10 to 20%. That's by 2050, meaning tomorrow. Such dramatic projections call for action and radical solutions for climate-smart agriculture and better water management. We'll see how the private sector is mobilizing to create resilience and sustainable access to water. Let's dive right in, first with a better view of the situation with Betsy Otto. The World Resource Institute has done extensive global level work mapping the effects of climate change on water resources. What are your conclusions on the water stress and the future competition between sectors, including agriculture and access to water?
Thanks, Estelle. Many of you may be familiar with a tool that World Resources Institute, my organization, has developed over the past 5 years or so called Aqueduct, which is a global, open source, global water risk mapping tool. It's now being heavily used by the private sector, by really thousands of companies. Over 400 companies use it to report on water-related risk. But it's also being used a lot by international organizations, by government, and so on. We take the best available, publicly peer-reviewed data sets and bring them together to give a composite picture of water-related stress around the world, looking at 15,000 catchments globally. And what we see when we look at that, one of the core indicators among the 12 current indicators in Aqueduct is called baseline water stress. And that looks at really competition over water, total demand relative to total annual renewable supply of water in a given place. And we look at it today, actually looking at long-term 60-year averages. And we also use IPCC data to project into the future. So those are all the technical details. So what does it tell us? Well, we're seeing water risk water stress increasing in many areas of the world. Water stress is already high in very many places in the world, meaning that 80 to 100% of available water is already being used, is already being demanded. Now, some of that water is used and then redischarged, but it gives you a sense of what the competition is already in many places. That's looking at surface water. We're going to be bringing out an updated version of Aqueduct this summer, which has major improvements in it in that it's about an order of magnitude more granular. It will also allow us to look at a combined metric of surface and groundwater for the first time, which of course, when we're thinking about irrigation and agriculture and food security, is very, very important. And what we see when we look at this picture today and projecting into the future is that there's no question that water stress is increasing in many areas, and many that you would expect, places like India, the Middle East, equatorial regions, the mid-latitudes, but also in places like parts of the US and many parts of China. And that's certainly due to climate change. So on the supply side, we're seeing really significant shifts in the timing and delivery of water and the variability from year to year of water. And in areas where rain is extremely important for growing food crops and for food security, the timing of water is really shifting in many places, as we've certainly seen. But I want to emphasize something else here to get to your question, Estelle. And that is, in many places, the chief driver of increased water stress is actually demand. It's not supply. It's that we're putting much more strain on our available water resources. We're not using them efficiently. Many sectors, the urban sector, industrial sector, and, for example, energy is projected to increase by 65% in terms of its total water demand in the next 10 years. A very significant, that's an increase in actual withdrawals. A 35% increase this is according to the IEA, a 35% increase in water demand. So as we need to grow more food, obviously, to feed the future, we're going to need more water. Hopefully, much of it's going to be improvements in rain-fed agricultural yields, but we're also going to have to be doing more with irrigation, of course. So we see these different sectors really being on something of a collision course. And I think that that's not well understood. We have to start to think about how can we better manage our water resources and allocate them across those sectors? How can we create incentives and other approaches that will bring together efficiencies across those sectors? For example, using recycled urban wastewater for, if it's properly recycled and treated, for growing crops or for industrial uses. There's a lot of sort of circular economy approaches that we could be utilizing. And the last thing I'll mention about our Aqueduct tool and our updates is that we're bringing out a new tool this summer as part of Aqueduct called Aqueduct Food. So for the first time ever, we're able to dive in deeply and look at the water-related risks, but also look at where all food crops are grown globally, both rain-fed and irrigated, and some important commodity crops as well, using International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI's data set. So for the first time, we have a tool, an open source tool that allows us to look at those two together, to look at areas of food insecurity. Interesting to also look at net trade, imports and exports. If a country is very reliant on imports, for example, of wheat, where are the wheat growing areas in the world? And what are the risks associated with those related to water? So we're excited about that. We think that that can help change the conversation too.
Thank you, Betsy. You mentioned irrigation, that's big money. I'm turning to IFAD for that. Given the projected impacts of climate change, what investments would be needed to build the resilience of smallholder farmers who rely on rain-fed agriculture? We're talking big money. Can the private sector step up? How?
First of all, you're right. In terms of investment, we talk about big money. However, I do not believe that for the smallholder, for the rural area, is a classic irrigation systems that we need to promote. I do believe that there's still a lot of room for what we call the small-scale irrigation system that can, even as a transition measure, that can really help the smallholders improving their productivity. We should also recall that in Africa, for example, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, almost 95, 97% of the agriculture are rain-fed on that. So investment in soil management, investment in addition to the small-scale or large-scale irrigation, investment in water retention, as well as improved seed that are also resistant to flood, as well as to drought, is going to be quite important. We do believe that we need to look at that from the whole, on the whole chain. It's one thing to help in terms of water management. Another thing is to help improving the productivity. But ultimately, is also the access to the market. So to make sure that you can get your money and you can make money out of it. The private sector would not be interested in FINE if there is no profit-making business too. So what this leads me to the private sector dimension. We do believe that particularly when it comes to water-related issues, the blending of the private sector and the public sector become even more important. In addition to creating the enabling environment for private sector to be able to attract private sector, very often public investment are necessary to pave the way for the private sector to come in. One point that, particularly when we talk about water, I think the expectations are going to be high from the private sector is the innovation, particularly in technology, that will help dealing with the water management issues. On one hand, when we talk about the water scarcity, it's important to also remember that in a lot of countries, if I take a country like Niger today, Niger, which is the Sahel, Niger receives on an annual basis all it needs, mathematically speaking, in terms of water, except that that water will fall
in a very few days.
in two or 2 months and a half during the whole year. So it's really much more of water management issue. So investment in technology that will also address the water management issue is also going to be quite important. And my final point is that technology also has to be affordable and available. And that, it will sometimes might be pointless to have a technology that will be out there, and if there is a small spare part that is needed, if you need to wait 6-9 months to get it, I mean, then you're back to square one. So it's all of those have to be taken into account.
Nick, I will follow on regarding the private sector. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has the Global Growth and Opportunity Program. How do you see philanthropy and the private sector working together?
Thank you. I think this builds very readily off President Houngbo's observations around the public and private sector, and of course philanthropy fits somewhere in between those things. So if we talk private sector, we typically think of either multinational corporations or small to medium enterprises, but we recognise also farmers of all sizes are private sector. And our focus in the Gates Foundation is on smallholder agriculture, smallholder farmers, and the way in which we can support smallholder farmers becoming more engaged in markets. And so we've long recognised, I think everyone agrees, it touched on in the earlier panel and picked up again now, that the private sector, in terms of the large and small companies, are really the engine room of growth. They do the heavy lifting in innovation and are very effective at translating discoveries into products rapidly, far better than I think most would acknowledge that the public sector can. At the same time, the public sector has historically played a critical role in feeding that pipeline of innovation, of discoveries, of investing in things that are either too risky or too long-term for a payoff to be viable for the private sector. So that partnership, public-private, has been a critical part of agricultural transformation in this country, in the country I'm from, in Australia, and in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia increasingly. So One of the concerning realities is that public funding for R&D has been, in agriculture, has been stagnant or declining for now at least a couple of decades. I think here in the US at 4.4 billion is the level it was 20 years ago, and there's been a 20% decline in the last 8 years. So that, I think, raises some important questions around where innovation will be coming from to feed into that engine room of growth that the private sector presents. So philanthropy plays an important role, but is very modest in the scheme of things, but has some unique differences in being able to perhaps take some longer term risks and higher risks. And I'll use an example if I take one moment just to talk about a long-term investment that the foundation has been supporting the University of Illinois in a partnership, global partnership to look at photosynthesis. And some may have seen in January a publication in Science where the researchers presented their findings in a test crop showing a 40% yield increase. Now, if we compare that to annual 1 to 1.5% productivity growth, this is tremendous implications for global agriculture in the global north and in lower income countries. And so these are longer term, higher risk payoffs, but are going to play increasingly important roles in enabling agriculture to meet a global population of 10 billion by 2050 in the context of a changing climate. An important aspect, I think, is also that same research has shown a 25% increase in water use efficiency in that test crop. Now, it's a long way still to go to get those into commercial crops and into products like cassava and cowpea that smallholders depend on, and the private sector will play a critical role in enabling that to happen. Just briefly, if I could touch on one of the other interfaces between philanthropy and the private sector, and that is the way in which we're able to support the business practices and models translating into the public sector in, for example, breeding programs. So taking the best of the modern technologies, modern approaches and practices that crop companies deploy, benchmark those, and then use them compared to breeding systems, for example, in the CGIAR, the global research system, and then national research systems in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So we can play that bridging and interface, and in doing so lift the performance, turn over varieties quicker, move them from 12, 15 years development into, as the private sector is able to do, half of that time.
Thank you, Nick. Stephen, at the World Bank, regarding investment, how do you see the water strategy and investment evolving? Where is it going? Because you're also investing quite a lot.
Yes. Excuse me, thank you. You know, I like to describe the evolution of our strategic approach to supporting water, whether it's water supply and sanitation, big resource management, flood control, or irrigation, as really following a continuum. And it's a continuum, what I call the build, service, sustain continuum. And I think our strategies, reflecting the thinking in the industry and the broader water world, was originally in the build phase. It was about how do we modify hydrology to fit human needs. Put up a dam, put up a canal, move water from here to there, change the timing, etc. Fantastic, very useful, very necessary at the time. Then over time we started to realize that, and our strategies reflected that didn't necessarily mean that farmers or drinking water customers were getting the services they needed when they needed them. And often those providing the services were huge drags on the budgets of governments because they weren't efficient, they weren't recovering costs, et cetera. So that's the service phase, is how do we then build institutions that are able to provide a good quality service, whether it's to a farmer or a drinking water customer or water treatment or flood control over a sustained period, and do that in a way that's financially viable. Where we are now and where our strategy work is reflecting, and we're trying to move our financial support through lending and technical assistance, is into the sustain phase. And Betsy mentioned the circular economy. It's really saying that now the responsibilities, whether it's for irrigation or water supply and sanitation or anything else, has to take into account the implications of what you're doing in that space for the overall hydrological cycle. So if you're putting water into agriculture, what does that mean for the quantity, the quality, and the timing of water flows through that system? A lot of water, when you bring in efficiency through drip irrigation, you're increasing consumptive use in many cases because people expand or they go into multiple cropping. That's great for agriculture. It can have very serious negative consequences for the basin as a whole. Agrochemicals, they get washed into the groundwater or into the rivers. Again, these are not bad things in and of themselves, but we have to explicitly take them into account up front. So when we're thinking about an ag strategy or an urban water strategy, et cetera, what does that mean for the overall hydrological system? And that's the big change that now is part of our strategy, and that we're working very hard, working with many of the people here on this panel and in the audience, to see how do we bring that in to the practical design of an irrigation program, or a water supply and sanitation program in a city, or a flood control mechanism. Bessie was reminding me today we're launching a report with WRI on green and gray infrastructure. So how do we do nature-based solutions that maybe reduce some of the trade-offs that we saw in the past when we were in the build phase, where we poured the concrete and said that takes care of it without noticing what did that mean for the rest of the cycle, for the rest of the environmental services. So that, again, moving from build to services and now to sustain. That's the challenge that we see, and that's what we're doing. Very quickly on the private sector aspect, obviously we have the International Finance Corporation, which directly works with the private sector. But in terms of bringing the private sector into this broader discussion, two things I want to highlight. We have a group called Water Resources Group 2030. And they establish multi-stakeholder platforms in countries, in large countries like India at the state level. And they basically pull together the government, private sector, civil society, other groups to have a dialogue about water, recognize the water problems, work on what can be done in terms of policies, but also what can be done in terms of pilot investments. And this includes everything from like Tata Group in India, PepsiCo, other groups, as well as obviously government and also civil society participants. So that's one way of bringing the private sector into the broader discussion around sustainability. The second is actually in the context of the farmer-led irrigation work that we're doing, again, with many of the people in this room. We had a conference January before last, and we had a meeting with the private sector, all the tech companies, et cetera. And we had quite whether it was drip irrigation, center pivots, et cetera. And we had a dialogue. It came out in a very interesting way. We came out with a grand bargain. They asked, and we agreed, to try and find ways to adjust our procurement processes in the projects we finance to allow more results-based approaches that allows them to bring in technological innovation more easily. On the other hand, what we said to them is, we need some of that technological innovation to reflect sustainability concerns. When you're doing some low-cost submersible pumps for farmer-led irrigation, are there mechanisms you can put in at low cost that help to collect information that can be used to help communities and governments and others to keep track and monitor the situation of the water resource and bring that into the dialogue of sustainability? Those are the sort of things that we're doing. So again, it's how do we bring the private sector into the big dialogue of sustainability, which is that third part of the evolution of strategy.
Kenya and Stephen mentioned India. That's where you're working. You're working on smart irrigation business models and implementation, which is what we're talking about in the end of the day. How do you make farmers change habit, adopt affordable, workable methods? How do you make climate smart agriculture happen on the ground? If you have good practices, things, ideas that you would want to share.
Thanks for the question, Estelle. Yes, we are involved in a climate smart agriculture project funded by Syngenta Foundation and also the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs. We work very closely with farmers, and we've in fact incubated a startup company which is devised for the first of, I think it's the first of its kind in the world, a custom hireable irrigation service model. So offering irrigation as a service to small farmers who cannot invest in high-tech irrigation. So yeah, I think what makes it effective is how efficiently or how effectively you've been able to disseminate and diffuse this technology. And that is where I think sometimes it is taken for granted that that is the role of extension agents, and technology adoption happens ultimately if there's a lot of work done by the extension agents. That is a given paradigm. And always you see extension workers mostly coming from the social purpose organizations or the government organizations, sometimes in the private companies, their marketing team which they're aggressively promoting, on the ground. One of the things that was a lesson for us from India is that you undermine the power of the end user, which is the small farmer in this case, to positively endorse the technology. And that is real technology diffusion. For instance, I'll give you an example. In Rajasthan state, we were working on result demonstrations to quantify and show the value proposition to the farmer. And we saw that one of the small young farmers, I wouldn't say small, he's a young farmer, but very smart, savvy. So he silently uploaded this video. He shot a video, and with his own description and his understanding, he uploaded it onto YouTube. And within a few weeks, there were 100,000 views across the entire Hindi-speaking belt of North India. And that was the power of social media and end-user endorsement. So this happened by chance, but if we actually included that in our program for technology adoption, I think that is a very efficient way of how people will learn. And then I've seen a lot of WhatsApp groups now among farmers. So that was a big learning for us on the ground.
And that comes back to the previous discussion with another panel, when one farmer mentioned peers discussion, which help a lot. Water isn't a traded commodity. What sorts of risks does relying on approximations of value, like fuel or land value, will have on water supplies, especially if irrigation scales up? And do you think that pricing water will change the game? That's the big question, but I have to ask. Betsy, I see you smiling.
That's the
And then
million-dollar
Kadia,
question.
I thought you wanted to answer
That
as
was
well.
for me, that question?
You can, but
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
I'm happy to take the first shot at it, but
Please.
I mean, that is the million-dollar question, right? If we continue to not price water, which we do almost in most of the world, of course, it's a common pool resource, and so we're going to see the challenges of using it effectively. And when you say that it's not traded, I think that's a really interesting point. I think about what China's trying to do right now with its 3 red lines. It set, essentially limits on how much water can be used by basin. How effective this will be remains to be seen. We've done some analysis actually to show that over the last couple of years, actually water stress in certain areas has been declining, and it seems that some of it may be this regulatory policy. The reason it relates to pricing is that without a cap, it's very difficult to price. So one of the things, and this relates to the private sector too, that WRI has been working on with many others, the CEO, UN Global Compact CEO Water Mandate, and many other groups, is to try to set a framework by which companies can set targets in watersheds where they operate or that are important for their supply chains. Because we don't really even have a mechanism for doing that. In most of the world, India is in some ways ahead and in some ways behind. We don't actually set limits on how much water can be withdrawn. And so unless you understand what that water balance looks like, what would sustainable yields mean, it is very difficult actually to do pricing. So you have to come in through other proxy measures. It's been one of the most challenging aspects of getting investment into water efficiency too. I mean, typically, actually, we do use the proxies. We have to say, well, you'll save this much energy too. In fact, we're doing some analysis for companies that will show them if they are saving energy, how much water they're also saving, because they care about that, but there's no good mechanism for pricing that in right now.
Kilian, you wanted to add something?
No, I thought you addressed it to me. Sorry about the confusion. So, but to add to what Betsy said, I think water is still seen as a commodity, no doubting that, but the perception that it is a free good or a free resource is fast changing, and because nobody understands the value of water more than a small farmer who's literally dependent on water for his livelihood. So they do actually accord a value to it, and we've seen it on the ground. When we were taking some surveys in Bundelkhand region of Madhya Pradesh, which is full of small farmers, very drought-prone farmers, we've seen that farmer who has water is actually giving a 50% crop share to an adjacent farmer who's supplying water. So he's actually valuing it. And the pricing is, in this case, not top-down. You can't drive down, but it is based on the cost economics that the farmers calculate, and then they come out with a formula. And also in our custom hireable service model, we've seen that the farmers are willing to pay for irrigation, which means essentially they're paying for water. So I think the perception is changing, and in a way climate change, with its manifestations and frequent droughts and all, it's only increasing the value perception of water from small farmers.
I want to come back to the private sector and profitability with you, President Houngbo. There's been loads of promises about the power of the PPP and improving conditions for smallholders, or what the private sector could bring in. But how can the private sector work when the basic business environment is uncertain, when the political climate is uncertain, and when there is poverty, low purchasing power? You mentioned it earlier, it has to be profitable for the private sector. So how do you make it go in?
This is
the second million-dollar question.
Indeed, indeed. This is the challenge that we are facing. That's what I was saying, that one of the basics is to make sure that you set up the conducive environment right, including all the governance issues. When we take water, which, let's face it, and Betsy was touching on that, is a sector where it's still very difficult sometimes to measure the impact and linking it back to the input on that. And when you link that to the agriculture and the smallholder, first of all, the agriculture is not necessarily the sector that attracts naturally the private sector. Let's start with
agriculture.
Agriculture. Then you add the condition that you make, it just makes it kind of double whammy. So we have to take that. That being said, I'm still quite more positive than I was 5 years ago. That's where the innovation comes also to play. When we talk about innovation, it's not just technological innovation. We talk also about innovation about how do you develop financial products. I'm thinking, for example, about the insurance schemes and guarantee schemes, where in this blending, you can have the multilateral, you can have the bilateral, from the government, from the public perspective, coming up with some kind of a guarantee scheme that will help the private sector reduce the global risk. IFAD, recently we set up what we call the ABC fund, which is Agribusiness Capital Fund, and Bamboo Capital is a fund manager, which is purely 100% private company, Luxembourg-based law. And with the European Union, for example, European Union is coming up with securing the first loss. And now they are in discussion with OPIC and with others for the mezzanine. And so the whole objective here is to be able to invest directly with the agribusiness SMEs, and that will in itself help when the private sector joins with the first loss covered by the public fund and the mezzanine with the bilateral. It creates much more incentive for the private sector to come in. The second thing, sometimes you also do have you need the volume to make it also attractive to the private sector. And there are more and more serious cases. You mentioned IFC, for example. IFC and other public and private sector are working, for example, in Rwanda, where we together, the IFAD and others are working with the smallholders to increase the soya and maize production, where therefore there's a Dutch company, DSM and the IFC and others that are setting up a transformation unit, and therefore that we have increasing the production, and therefore you make the volume for. So it does work despite the challenge we have. But what I'm simply saying is that if you go on a traditional standalone and a silo approach, then very likely the chance of failure are higher.
It's not going to work out. We're going to jump in with this the questions, from the audience. We have mics everywhere. I see a hand here, and it's a woman, so she's first. And I have a second one there.
Thank you. Jinya Churt Nakata from the Nature Conservancy. My question is a little bit, we're looking at resilience, we're looking at private sector, and I feel like there is this huge disconnect still between the environment and agriculture. And yet agriculture is wholly dependent on the environment for its productivity. And let me give just one precise example. Latin America is the largest net food exporting region on the planet. Yet if you try and find resources for agriculture, like Gates Foundation or Feed the Future or others for South America, you get crickets. There's nothing. Yet deforestation is 3 times the global rate, and that's driven by agriculture. So I just feel like when we look at this globally and we look at the critical importance of agriculture also to contributing to climate, mitigation, these types of disconnects, we need to broach that gap. So how can we do that?
I think that's yours.
I'm happy to lead off because I'm sure there'll be others too, but I think that's
It's a key
an
question.
absolutely critical question. And if we look at, say, since the post-2007-8 food price crisis, the world has responded in an amazing way to rebuild global food stocks. So if we look pre the food price crisis, productivity growth had been driven more, or production had been driven more by productivity growth than it had by increasing the area. And the statistics are quite compelling in that regard, that it was through better practices on the existing land, predominantly, rather than expansion. But post 7-8 food price crisis, the opposite happened, and agriculture expanded again its footprint. That just speaks to me of the importance of innovation and getting better technologies that enable production to increase without putting a greater demand on the world's water resources or land resources. And that's going to get even more critical as climate change plays out, as urbanisation continues to compete for agricultural land, and those tensions expand, and agriculture risks pushing into land that's providing a whole range of environmental services. So technology is part of that answer, but in and of itself, that has the potential to make greater risks, of course, because as agriculture becomes more profitable, unless you've got the governance in place and the resource management arrangements in place, then we'll continue to see supplying food for the world having a larger impact on the ecosystems and the environment on which we all depend. So critically important piece, and I see the foundation, the Gates Foundation, plays a role in the technology end, the innovation end, but also how it can work with governments around governance and getting better data, better information around the existing land and water resources, and support policy options and trade-off decisions to chart a more sustainable course for increased productivity and production.
Stephen.
Just very briefly, it's not a question of money. So sometimes when you don't see certain players in, it's because it's not a financing gap issue, and that's what they respond to. But what we're working on, and many others here are, is really reorienting the subsidies in agriculture. There's trillions and trillions of dollars going into ag subsidies around the world, including in Latin America. And the idea is can we reorient those subsidies to provide incentives, support for agriculture to fully internalize how it works with nature in a sustainable way? And we see that there's some policies, and the US has done that to a certain extent. The EU is doing that in a big way. And that's really where we feel there's an opportunity, combined with the innovations on technology, to really make a big difference. If we can reorient those trillions of dollars of subsidies away from simply produce, and sometimes the wrong crop in the wrong place at the wrong time, but towards rewarding farmers for bringing in the inherent stewardship that they know. Farmers are by nature stewards of the environment, but often they're pushed through the incorrect signals that they receive from subsidy policies and other elements away from that. So we want the subsidies to reinforce that stewardship mentality for nature as a whole, because as you say, it's really about sustaining the resource base so we can continue to produce food, but also to continue to produce other environmental services, not just the food production services. So I say, really, I think that's maybe our biggest opportunity, is on reorienting subsidies.
Another question?
Morning. I'm Fred Davies, and I'm a horticulturist from Texas A&M University. And one of the things I'm not hearing is actually food waste. We waste a third of our food in the world, either through poor production systems or transportation. That's a heck of a lot of water that's being lost around the world. The other thing too, for instance, is for those of us who do plant water-related research, we talk about virtual water, the amount of water that goes into producing a crop. So I love my California almonds, but that's basically a gallon of water to produce one of those almonds. I love my California avocados, but that's a high water usage plant being grown in the Central Valley, very arid. Out of Arizona, for instance, they're producing alfalfa from basically what we call ancestral wells, from the standpoint that the recharge of those wells will not happen during our lifetime. But alfalfa that's being shipped to, for instance, Saudi Arabia for cattle production, basically is a high water usage crop. So those types of policies really need to be looked at. It's not just the crop, it's the amount of water that went into producing that crop. And one of the things that I think we really need to be talking about here is more of a package approach. We just can't talk about water. We have to talk about all the other aspects that goes into it. And really we need to be looking at more private-public partnerships. A good example of that is Amarin out of Kenya. They're producing high-value horticultural crops. They're using drip irrigation systems, and drip is not rocket science. It's been around for 50 years. And it's basically mentorship. It's using controlled environment agriculture, and it's basically geared towards urban areas. 2/3 of us are going to be urban in the next 20 years or so. And there's more disposable income. So the point I'm trying to make is, if the panel could really comment on some of this stuff.
You could find a question mark. Go ahead.
On the food loss and waste question, absolutely. And I think this is a subject that is starting to get a great deal more attention. There's actually a goal, a target within the Sustainable Development Goals that actually addresses this. And there's a whole group now globally of champions that includes many of the major food, consumer branded product food manufacturers and distributors, and the largest growers around the world, but also many, many governments to start to tackle this question. On the point about, so there's much more that needs to be done, but I think we've actually been tracking even some of the public dialogue about this and how frequently food loss and waste is now being discussed among the public, and that actually is rising. And the other thing I would mention is that in this sort of package of different alternatives, and that also gets to the land question that we were just talking about, there are obviously many, many reports and resources out there, but World Resources, WRI does a World Resources report every 3 years, and this past one we actually spent 5 years on was around sort of creating our sustainable food future. And we just put out the synthesis report of how you bring together all of these different strategies, what the policy dimensions are of that. We've actually done some analysis on how much that could reduce the food gap, but also how much we can reduce in land that is now taken over by agriculture, how much we can reduce food loss and waste, what we have to do with shifting diets, and how you bring all of those components together. So I would just recommend that as something to look at if people are interested.
We have 2 minutes for one last question, but I would agree with Professor that just spoken earlier. If you just pick one person for the question. Who is it? Madam. We've been talking a lot about crops. We didn't mention meat production, which is part of agriculture and which is emitting tons of CO2. Madam.
Thank you very much. Thank you, panel. Thank you, President Houngbo, and good to see you. My question is, first of all, I'm very happy that you mentioned about small-scale irrigation for smallholder farmers. And I grew up I'm from Africa, grew up hearing about the transformation power of a small-scale irrigation for a smallholder sector. And after years, today we are also talking about 90 to 97% of agriculture, small-scale agriculture in Africa is rain-fed. My question is, what is holding us back? Why are we not investing? Is it too conflict area? Is it resources? Is it technology? we do have World Bank, IFAD, the Gates Foundation, and the multi-sectoral investment areas. So what is really holding us up? I wanted to hear that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No,
You'll have the final word.
Yes, thank you so much. I know we are running off time. One is that it's a real issue to the irrigation system in Africa, even when you compare to Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, for example. While advocating the small-scale irrigation, for me is to deal with the practical aspect of the huge investment needed, particularly the public investment. But it's not to say that the small-scale irrigation is better than the whole full-fledged irrigation. I want to also be clear on that. What is holding us back is also we are investing a lot, IFAD, in the smallholders. But I'm not saying that, I'm not promoting that the answer is only from the smallholders. It's really, I want also the smallholders to become large-scale holders one day. We also have to be clear. We need to put agriculture as a commodity, not just a survival activity. We need to train our youth to look at agriculture that as a way for me to have a decent income-generating activity, which is one. And very quickly, also in terms of the food waste and loss, it is also an opportunity for the private sector, actually. And IFAD is now developing some tools with Rabobank in that connection. And the issue between ag and the environment and what we're doing, and I do believe we have to do more and more on that, in every agriculture-related kind of initiative or project, is always to peg a climate change and dimension to it that can contribute to the solution.
You wrapped it up. Thank you so much. Please join me to thank our panel.